Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Other Side of Medicine. I am Dr. Christosic, the host of this program. We're glad that you're spending some time with us this evening. And tonight, I'll be going over a topic that I think is relative to our day and age, talking about the relationship between the gut and chronic disease. There's so much information, there's so much research to show the deep connection between the two that once I present this information to you, I believe that you'll look at the gut in a whole different light. However, I must tell you that because of the fact that I have problems with my internet, I just switched to AT&T nonetheless, and I thought I was going to get better internet service, and it turns out that it's actually worse. I don't know a lot about technology, but I do know that I found out after the fact that my internet service with AT&T only provides 100 megabytes of power, which is peanuts. I switched from another server and I am really disappointed. So tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over and do an overview with you of my presentation so that you could have a good understanding of where I'm going with this presentation, because there's a lot of information that I put together. This is not going to just be 1 week. It'll be a couple, 2-3 weeks I'll be going over this information with you. So I really want to set the tone and really give you a good understanding of where I'll be going with this whole presentation, because I can tell you with full surety that your doctor is not going to tell you about this information. So let me go ahead and open up my PowerPoint here. Give me just 1 second. And I will set this up, presentation, and share my screen. There we go. And okay, we're going to go with the PowerPoint. I'm going to go ahead and put that up right now. And from the beginning, there we go. So once again, the Other Side of Medicine is the gathering place for common sense, science, evidence-based information, and cooperation with nature. That's everything that we do on here on this podcast. I've been doing that for the last 30 plus years on the radio, and now moving on to the podcast realm. And so I believe that those 3 elements, those 3 principles are powerful agents for change so that you can live independently healthy. And that's what we're talking about. Not to rely on drugs and surgery as the first measures for your health care. My goal is to help you to be able to use natural medicine first, drugs and surgery last. That is my full intention, and I hope that you would agree with me that that would be the wisest choice. So let me go through my presentation, give you a glimpse of it so that you can see where I'm going with this and be able to understand how robust this presentation is going to be. Now, my course presentation for the next 2 or 3 weeks is going to be called the Gut 911 Prescription. You know, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, the father of modern medicine, said this 2,000 years ago: all disease begins in the gut. And I can tell you with full surety that today the research is beginning to validate his words. 2,000 years later, it's coming to fruition because the research is just overwhelming with the amount of information of the connection, the global connection of the gut and the rest of the body. It's not just the gut that has issues from the poor digestion or a bad set of gut bacteria. Every single system of the body is affected, whether it's the lungs, the heart, the kidneys, the liver, the brain. Yes, as a matter of fact, scientists are calling the gut the second brain because the microbiome, the bacteria in the gut, has a very sophisticated nervous system inside of it that has many more times of neurons than the brain in our head has. So it's pretty dramatic. It produces inside the gut hormones like serotonin and dopamine. 50% of all of dopamine and serotonin, the feel good hormone, is produced in the gut. There are so many similarities, and we'll go into that in deeper context, but I really want you to understand that a healthy gut leads to a healthy you. That's the most important thing. We're going to go into talking about the digestive system at a rudimentary level, and we're not going to go into a college level. We're going to go to, you can understand it at an 8th grade level. Then I'm going to talk about the brain and the gut connection. There's an axis between the brain and the gut. And that is so profound when you learn the connection between the gut and the brain and how the dysfunction inside the brain can cause so many neurological problems, including depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, and on and on and on, autism. So it's really worthwhile to understand how important it is for you to take care of your gut. We're going to go into how the gut lining is a protective mucus lining that's very similar to how the brain operates. The brain has a barrier so you don't let toxic elements come in. And the gut has a barrier too. It doesn't let toxic elements come in unless things go awry and then you start having problems. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the absorption of nutrients, how that occurs. We'll talk about how when the gut lining gets disrupted, it gets perturbed, that is going to create what we call leaky gut. We'll talk about that in great deal and how you'll have decreased absorption of nutrients and you'll have pathogenic bacteria that can enter inside your bloodstream and travel throughout your entire body, causing havoc. We'll talk about the microbiome, which is the collective bacteria and microorganisms that live in and outside and around your body. This is so important to understand because when we live in a Western society, the gut microbiome is being perturbed in a dramatic way and it's being upset. And we'll look at indigenous tribes from around the world who have a whole different set of microbiome on the skin and inside the gut and how that affects our well-being. We'll talk about that in great detail. So we'll talk about how our microbiome, the bacteria on the outside of our body and inside of our body, changes with age. However, we can make a huge difference in how to protect it so we don't have it decline and cause chronic disease. So we'll talk about that in great detail. We'll talk about the garden inside your belly of the bacteria that's present and how important it is for your overall health. We'll look at the functions of the microbiota, the bacteria living inside your gut. There's over 100 trillion bacteria. When I use the word bacteria, let me just set the precedent here. When I use the word bacteria during this presentation, it includes things like viruses and fungus and protozoa and yeast and other types of microorganisms like archaea. These are all the microorganisms that live inside of our body and on the outside as well. We'll talk about those in great detail and how those play an integral part in our health and our well-being. So we'll go over all the functions. Then we're going to look at the sophisticated communication system that presides inside of the gut, the microbiome, the bacteria, how it communicates with the entire body and how that affects our overall health in a significant way. We'll talk about the environment and how everything we do, the choices that we make, the foods that we eat, if you use medications and overuse those medications, where you live, the changes in our life stages, the birthing process, everything that we go through in life, the cycle of life affects the microbiome dramatically. We're going to get into talking about how every single system of the body is affected by the bacteria living inside your gut, and how every system of the body has a communication with the gut bacteria. It's mind-boggling. We're going to talk about how the time-sensitive nutrition programming that occurs inside the gut in the first 3 years is paramount to health in adult stage. The first 3 years sets the stage for the microbiome that you'll carry for the rest of your life. So it's very important that you take good care prenatally and for the first 3 years of the the infant's health. Very important. And also the health of the parents. Then we're going to talk about how the diet and lifestyle affects the infant microbiota from the parents to the feeding of the infant and everything in between, including the profound effect that things like breast milk have and the negative effects that antibiotics to children in early ages for ear infections and other things that literally research shows it's not necessary. You can treat these things without antibiotics and not have all the ramifications. So we'll get into that. We'll talk about diet and the microbiome and how the Western diet, the standard American diet, abbreviated SAD, SAD, standard American diet, is devastating to the microbiome. And we'll get into how things like sugar and even sugar substitutes, sucralose and these other artificial sweeteners like aspartame, and even things like stevia, you'll be surprised how can it affect negatively the microbiome. You'll be surprised when I'll talk about these things. And we'll talk about diversity of the microbiome, the bacteria living in your gut, and how our microbiome in the Western countries is so different in a positive way. It should be different because they're living in a different environment, but the diversity of the microorganisms living inside of the indigenous tribes is so much more robust. They have sometimes 3 times more population of bacteria living inside their gut. And we'll talk about how beneficial that is to have diversity. We'll talk about the interplay between good and bad bacteria. We'll talk about what's called commensal microorganisms that live inside of our gut, but they don't have a lot of positive effect other than the fact that they do provide some nutrients. They live harmoniously, but sometimes they can become opportunistic and they can cause damage to our bodies if the right environment is set up in a negative fashion. If you don't have the right lifestyle, it can create these opportunistic microorganisms that live inside of us in small quantities, but they can start to raise their ugly head and multiply and cause havoc and disease inside the body. We'll talk about SIBO, small intestinal bacteria overgrowth. Very little bacteria should be living inside of the small intestine. Most of the bacteria live inside of the large intestines. Should not have very much bacteria living inside the small intestine. And when it happens, when it gets an overgrowth, it's called SIBO, and there's many symptoms and diseases that will start to develop because of that. We'll talk about leaky gut syndrome, when the barrier, that lining of the gut, which shouldn't allow toxins to go in, gets damaged, and it allows bacteria, toxins, and other environmental toxins and elements that are irritants enter inside the bloodstream. We'll talk about that and how that can be corrected. All these things, the body has the ability to heal itself, and we're going to share with you how to help and aid the body to do that. We'll talk about how stress influences the gut bacteria and how it interplays in disease. We'll talk about how the bacteria in the gut and heart disease and stress interplay, and how scientists are showing that atherosclerosis, clogging of the arteries, and strokes and heart attacks can be precipitated in part or sometimes more significantly by the action of the gut bacteria. We'll talk about, again, the connection between the strokes which happen up in the brain and the heart, and how these mechanisms occur. And I'll give you an elementary understanding, not in depth, but a elementary understanding, so you can see the profound effect that what occurs inside the gut has a global effect, even in the circulatory system and the heart. We'll talk about obesity and the gut microbiome and the research is that beginning to really explode, both in mice studies and other animal studies and in human studies now. We'll give you an action plan to help you to be able to overcome the problems that occur, the chronic diseases that develop, and how you can live independently healthy by restoring your gut integrity and health. So these are all the elements that I'll be talking about. I hope there was no interruption tonight in the service of the internet. I apologize that we're going to have to end this abruptly tonight. I'm going to be getting a new internet service coming in on Monday or Tuesday, and I'll be getting 1 gigabyte of power so that I will have no interruptions at all with my presentations in the future. I'm excited about that. So please tell your family and friends about next week's presentation. I believe that you're going to find this to be quite informative. You're going to get a lot of practical information on how you can protect yourself, your family, and reverse chronic disease and allow the body to heal itself. This is the power of the body that God has placed inside of us. He programmed inside of our bodies. And I'm going to show you how to do it. I've been doing it for over 30 years. My friends, I've been talking about the relationship between the gut and our global health, the entire body, the connection between all the systems of the body for over 30 years on my radio program. And as I mentioned to some of you in the email I sent out today, I used to have doctors call me on my radio show from the medical profession and would laugh at me and challenge me and say, "You have no idea what you're talking about." And they would call me a quack. They would call me all kinds of names. And yet I've been vindicated because now, 30 years later, the research is just so robust. And the data coming out, the research data is replete with how the gut affects every system of the body and how the new frontier of medicine is to take care of the gut and the body will take care of you. Now, it's not the only thing, of course, that's going to cause disease, but it's one of the most profound effects that we have and what we have control of. So, my friends, I'll be back next week, and I promise you we won't have any interruptions with the service. Tell your family and friends about the presentation. You won't hear this information from your doctor. And once again, I'm bringing you breakthrough information that you can take to the health bank so that you can live independently healthy. So, my friends, may God bless you, and I will talk to you next week with a whole lot of power on the internet and to give you power to live a long life in good health. So, God bless you, and good night. We'll see you next week.